We need to be able to have conversations without feeling like we're going to say something that gets us thrown in jail because people happen to be offended.
Skepticism. Do you know what you believe?
All right, folks, welcome back to the Pangburn Hangout. We are going to be hanging out with one of our Pangburn skeptics, Dave SP 1903. That's who we're going to be hanging out with today. I am going to bring us over there. The Discord link, if you guys want to join this conversation. Let's see here. We're going to use this one. This is the one we've been using. But you can use the Discord link that is on the screen here in the description of this video. And I believe it's even in like the video label. Use that to join the conversation on Discord. You just join the Discord and then come in and then you click over on the voice chat channel where you see people's little emoticons brightening up. That's where you click, you have a conversation, and that's what we do at Pangburn. The rules on the Discord are gotta engage in good faith discourse, number one. So just come to conversations, not looking to be cool, not looking to preach or proselytize. Just come to the discussions in a genuine way, and that's the basic idea of what good faith discourse is. But if you want more details on that, in the pinned post on the Pangburn channel, you'll see the rules. So you got to engage in good faith discourse. You have to be helpful. If you're engaging in just constant unhelpfulness, I remember Douglas Murray telling me once that this was the one thing we refer to as the cunt in the room. If you're constantly just being a cunt in the room, fucking up conversations for the sake of, fucking them up, that's quite unhelpful, and you're not going to last long. And then number 3 is no defamation. If you're going to come in and try to defame someone's name without providing any evidence to whatever claim you're making about the individual, and it could, potentially hurt their career or something like that, you better be able to substantiate your claim, or it's just defamation. So those are the 3 things we police on the channel, on the Discord channel or network or server, and that's pretty much it. With these new Pangburn Hangouts, I'm appointing admins and mods to their own, day, giving them their own segment, and I kind of want to be, a participant in these conversations and let them kind of take them wherever they want, and that's kind of the goal. What up, Scott?
It's the idea, Trav, that you actually want to be able to partake in the conversation opposed to having to be a moderator to it.
Kind of, yeah. That's kind of well, I'll tell you honestly, like for me, I like hearing I like other people starting conversations. Like I like to hear their initial thoughts without me, I feel like sometimes maybe
influences where the things are going.
Right. I want to like hear the genuine first ideas out of people's minds of what they think, and then go through the process of, tweaking and seeing where we can improve.
Yep. Well, so it's always a process of if you're not doing this in your own thought of criticizing your own opinions, it's always a process of criticism, right? Like that's sort of where it needs to come from. You need to be able to look at other people's and your own ideas in a critical way and be like, well, does this really make sense?
Sure. And then also sorting out if there's something in you that doesn't care about what's actually true, also trying to go through the philosophical process of trying to figure out why that is the case with you. Like why is the pursuit of truth not a pleasurable pursuit? Or why do you feel like truth doesn't matter? And a lot of the time this has to do with people just not realizing they actually do really appreciate what is true. Like, you know, when you call 911 when you get in a car accident, right? All of those processes are based on true findings of reality and coming up with the best demonstrable ways to deal with things. What up, Dave?
Yeah.
What's up? Can you hear me?
I think people do get caught into cynicism without understanding what cynicism is beforehand, and then they just think, oh, this is just the natural way to think. No, you've got to understand these modes of thought that you're coming into.
I had this weird thought the other day when I was falling asleep. I was listening to Carl Sagan. I'm retaking in Carl Sagan's The Pale Blue Dot.
Good. So good.
Yeah, just an incredible book. Just constant flow of poetry. That it's just like, I won't get into the depths of that now. But I was sitting there listening, and then I just for some reason this emerged in my mind that, you know, cynicism is almost like the first step on your road to skepticism. It's
sort of I sort of think about it maybe separately. I think people come to skepticism and then turn to cynicism.
I used to think that, Scott. I used to think, but when I analyze and look at what they thought they had achieved with their foundation in skepticism, when they thought that they were, you know, skeptically inquiring about things, I tend to find that they weren't, and maybe they are sometimes, but in most cases that I would examine, I would be like, well, wait a sec. It was like they had it and then they fell off the rails, but did they even have it in the first place? And I think it's possible for someone to have it, but then it can fall to shit. What up, Mace? How's it going today?
Mace.
Yeah. Welcome. Fine, thanks. Welcome back, brother.
Mace Starwalk.
I am the Mace Starwalk.
Is that like Luke Skywalker? Is that a Star Wars reference?
It's kind of like a cross between Star Walker and Star Lord and
Mace Windu.
Mace Windu,
yeah, exactly. yeah.
So, Dave, what are we talking about today?
Yeah, well, you signed me up for an epistemology slot, which I actually think would be interesting discussion to go over, especially since you and I have had some disagreements on this topic in the past that we haven't really gotten to hammer out. But especially just kind of with the modern context of social media and how ideas are so much more efficacious like in the modern age and how they spread so easily. And a lot of people buy into a lot of conspiracy theory. We see the effects of that, like
it's nonsense.
Dude, we're seeing it. We're seeing it today everywhere with COVID, and the vaccine. It's like unfortunately, at a time like this, you would wish the anti-vax numbers to be on the kind of going on the down curve, but
you would hope.
But man, I had to post last night. I was just like, these fucking people. We have people otherwise moral, good acting, well-to-do people trying to convince the elderly people in their family that really need the vaccine that there's something scary or bad about the vaccine. And like it's just when people don't realize the nastiness and destructiveness of what their actions and their words.
It's such a polarized view that
what do you guys think about people who actively push that kind of stuff, who we're pushing an idea that is fundamentally negative to human well-being.
I think it's good for humanity and the war of ideas. I think it's good for us to give examples of skepticism in motion killing these things, and obviously to the radical consumers of conspiracy, they're going to still stay glommed onto that. But I'm talking in that section of kind of gray fog air where people don't know where to step, because typically they don't do a lot of abstract creative thinking. They're typically, just doing their jobs and trying to get some fucking time off to spend with their family. But then something like this happens where it requires some critical thinking, right?
Well, I do also have a very soft spot in my heart for people who, there's people who be like, oh, I didn't take it serious because I thought it was the China hoax or whatever. And then they end up getting it and they end up dying. And there's multiple accounts of people being like, I want to tell all you guys, I was just like you. I thought this is all like a hoax and everything, but here I am in the hospital. I'm dying.
Even from the beginning, this whole COVID-19 thing is a great catalog of how I'm going to show how skepticism must be the goal of education, because right off the beginning, I say things like, okay, the evidence is showing us so far that this thing spreads very rapidly, very easily between everyone. But when it comes to killing, it's mostly going to be killing the elderly. So the world focus and plan should really be about doing what's best to protect the elderly. And I think some of the methods and approaches to this were better than others. I think elements of what Sweden did were correct, but what I hope is that I hope in the West, like in Canada and the United States and the World Health Organization, all of these groups that are supposed to be the leaders of information, that I hope they don't feel like that this has been a clean cut, cruising along nice process with this pandemic, because I'll tell you, just as a fucking guy sitting in his fucking office, there were so many mistakes made that could be avoided if only one person in that collective room would have had a solid foundation in skepticism. It just
I also do think there's the problem of if you've ever seen South Park with Captain Hindsight, he comes in after something happened and is like, "Oh, you shouldn't have done that."
This is look. This is why, Scott. This is why it's important. It's damn important to for skeptics, for people with good solid foundation of skepticism, to catalog their thinking through these events, because it will show them if people are actually using skepticism and not some form of cynicism or pseudo skepticism. If they're actually using skepticism, you will see that they did not make any unfounded claims. And when the governments erred on the side of caution, which is, it sounds very, very safe and nice, and it sounds like a nice thing to do. Well, it wasn't too nice for the people who were on the verge of suicide anyway.
Yeah.
Like
exactly.
Yeah.
So,
what was that, Dave?
Yeah, I was going to say, go ahead, Dave, because this is your conversation. I think maybe I butted in too early. I just want you to get out what you want to get out.
Oh, no worries. Like, talk as you want. Yeah. I was just going to say that one of my biggest frustrations when I'm watching the way, at least the rhetoric that's involved with the COVID-19 responses, and the people who are, especially in the United States and the mainstream media, and how there are costs to these lockdowns, right? There are costs that are often framed as quote unquote economic, and that term is used almost as a pejorative, like it's just some money.
Right.
Some money that we can get back. And I mean, it's just a child, in my view at least, it's a childishly myopic way of looking at the function of the economy and the way that it intimately intersects with essentially every aspect of your existence, whether it's your ability to put food on the table for your kid or pay your mortgage or really do anything. I mean, we've elected as a species of human, we've elected to live in mostly in these enormous metropolitan areas where all of our necessities are abstracted and removed essentially to the point where we just click for our groceries online. All of these artificial systems, the economic systems, undergird every element of our existence. I mean, it is crucially important to keep that infrastructure healthy, and that's not just some money. This is we're talking about essentially survival. And when we're also talking about human loss and human well-being, when we're seeing suicide rates go up, we're seeing substance abuse and alcohol abuse rates go up, and there's many
social extremism going up.
Social extremism, exactly.
When I think you sort of run into this sort of like interesting like intersection of thoughts, because I think the very idea of everything that's going on is all about CYA. And CYA is fundamentally a corporate ideology. Cover your ass. No matter what we do, we have to cover our ass so we can't be held liable for some sort of negative effect that happens. So right off the bat, when we see something along the lines of what COVID is, we say, okay, this does have the potential to kill a fuckload of people. And if all these people die and we didn't do anything, even for the idea of a politician being like, hey, I got to cover my ass so I can get reelected again, but at the same time also a store being like, hey, I got to cover my ass so I don't just start letting all these people in, and then I can be liable for lawsuits about negligent death based on my response to these, into this specific situation, So it just develops in such a way, like think about especially airlines. Like you're on a plane with recycled air. Do you really want to take the chance of having somebody who has a virus that can be spread to other people?
I thought you were going to say eating Chipotle before you go up there.
That'll just blow your asshole out.
Shared air. My mind went straight to shit.
but you know what I mean? Like airlines specifically have sort of this like really high bar where they cannot fuck up, because there are no protections in law that says, hey, an airline let somebody on the plane that had a communicable disease and everybody got sick from it. That airline's going to get fucking sued,
Yeah, a lot of people have been confusing with COVID as well, like what it means for the manufacturers of the vaccines to make deals with countries that they're not going to be liable. The reason is quite simple, and it's a very smart move, because think of the amount of unfounded litigation that will be filed. Not the founded one. Like the founded one, you might have some case of founded litigation that really needs to go through the process and see if there was something going on here. But it's the unfounded one. Think of how swamped, if you're distributing this many products. Like what are you going to do with a million court claims? Like you know what I mean? It's
exactly. Well, that's sort of the exact
it's worse than
reason
that because. Sorry, I might have a little bit of lag on my end if I'm interrupting, but it's worse.
No, it's all you, Dave.
I was going to say that it's worse than that, because when companies are distributing products, for-profit products, at least it's different around the world, but at least in American law, there's a doctrine of products liability.
Yeah.
Which essentially just removes the negligence principle entirely. And so you don't actually have to demonstrate that a company was negligent if you're injured by a product. If you're injured by a product and there's a manufacturing defect, even if there was an absolutely appropriate quality assurance program, couldn't be any better. If there's a defect in the product, that's all you have to show essentially in order to recover from a company, a corporate, like a corporate entity.
Well, sort of, because I mean that's, people always talk about, like, you see these warning stickers on things, like, oh, who's the idiot that did that? Like, no, there's probably nobody that did that. But that warning sticker that you see on something, like, hey, don't put your hand in this blade of this wood chipper. That came down from a lawyer being like, okay, all we got to do is put this warning down on something. So if somebody does something stupid, we're protected.
Kind of, yeah. It's actually, that's a different doctrine. So if there's a manufacturing defect, like I was mentioning earlier, that's you're essentially, you as a manufacturer of products, you just have to internalize the risk of manufacturing defect. It's kind of a forced legal insurance for everybody else. Basically, if one of the 1 in a million cars that Ford manufactures, the one that blows up or something that you just can't avoid as a consequence of variance in manufacturing, they're liable for that.
But I think you have the perfect example of that with the what company was it with the airbags that were killing people because they were faulty made? This is a big deal. I mean, they recalled millions of fucking cars because some company in China had made like these faulty airbags that like were shooting metal into people's faces when they blew up.
I was about to make a joke that they shouldn't have put the poison darts attached to but the fact that they were actually shooting metal, that's incredible.
It was like people were getting fucking just completely maimed and killed from these airbags exploding.
Right.
God.
And there are reasons that you might want to. So then there's the warning. So this is the warning thing, right? The warning thing is different because essentially there's another legal doctrine of alternative designs. And if you make a product that's just needlessly dangerous, and there was a really cheap part that you could have put on, and it wouldn't have affected the safety of the product at all, and you've sold it without this part instead, then someone can sue you in tort, essentially, for designing a defective product, and that's a separate area. And the warnings thing is part of that, because if there's a foreseeable misuse of the product, right? So if this is you'll see this on
not even misuse. I mean, I think sometimes those warnings are put in even with something that, I mean, I guess you could technically say it's misuse, but it's pretty close to the actual use of the purpose, and they can still get away with.
Right. So the
skirting liability.
Right. So the liability will either come from the manufacturing defect, the reasonable alternative design, essentially, where the product's just not as safe as it could be, or a failure to warn, essentially. If the product is as safe, like take a handsaw, you can't take the blade off of a handsaw because you won't be able to cut anything. But that necessitates a certain degree of risk, essentially, in that whoever's operating this handsaw might cut themselves. And sometimes there's this famous case where this guy removed a blade guard from a saw, and there were some questions over, whether or not there should be. Actually, this isn't really the same idea, but like, let's say that there's a blade guard on a saw, and you don't have a warning that says don't remove this blade guard.
Yeah, it's funny. A lot of people do remove that blade guard. Yeah.
Yeah, which is why nowadays, if there's no warning, so that's foreseeable at this point because people do that. Exactly. So nowadays, if you sell a saw and it doesn't have a warning that says "Do not remove blade guard," the blade will fly off and hit you in the face. You may be liable for that at this point because it doesn't disclose risks that you're aware of that the consumer is not. And so when you're, especially if you're rolling out a vaccine, just to bring it back to the vaccine thing, and you're doing so on an accelerated schedule, there are going to be some risks that you're going just going to have to swallow if you're going to forego the normal assortment of tests and the battery of tests that we normally force the new pharmacological substances or vaccines to go through. And we're seeing this already. I mean, you do see a slight tick up in. I think I've read that you're seeing a slightly higher incidence rate of allergic reaction to certain components.
Yeah, that's literally the only thing we're seeing, because like the allergy component is one thing that takes a lot of broad testing to
exactly
really nail down, and that would be something that, okay, under the circumstances we say, no big deal, we're going to forego that. There's going to be some people that are going to have the reactions, but a lot of people think that these are unforeseen, like people post it's like, oh, unforeseen reactions to, it's like, no, we expected allergic reactions.
Yeah, especially the people who are making it knew exactly, like, yeah, there are these certain risks here, but we think these risks are worthwhile to take.
Minimal.
Bigger. Yeah.
Well, and there's the doctor that everyone was like, and here's what happens when you have something like a regular stroke occur in society. This one doctor happened to get the flu vaccine, the COVID-19 vaccine 2 weeks before he had a stroke. And then these fucking idiots in the media put a fucking headline on it, print it out, and then all the retarded people pass it around social media, and they're like, look at this, oh my god. And then I'm like, yeah, you've really discovered something by posting this article, haven't you? You should be rushed to the front of the line to the WHO and the CDC to show them what you just retweeted.
No, I mean, with those people, it's all emotional.
It's just it fucking pisses me off, man.
Not to butt in here, but just so I have some context, what are we talking about?
Vaccines, the rollout of the COVID vaccine, and the implications of legal challenges based off of the lack of research leading up to the rollout, I guess, is what we're.
I see. By the way, Travis, hi.
Hey, how's it going, brother? I'm glad you're back.
Still here. Well, if you like my thoughts on it, which I'm sure none of you do, but I'll offer them anyway, because maybe they'll be somewhat useful. I'm not taking that damn vaccine, because I have to say, in my experience, most things that are rushed are not very good. Which is kind of what I feel like the gentleman who explained what you guys were talking about kind of alluded to when it comes to the whole idea of, I don't know. It just feels like, am I wrong in concluding that most vaccines for most ailments that could happen to a human being that could be cured by a vaccine take years to develop? And this one took less than a year, and I'm supposed to put trust that it's actually going to do what it's supposed to do?
Yeah, a really long time. But at the same time, there were certain specific vaccines that were developed very fast in the past that have benefited humans greatly. So
Aaron, one thing you might want to do, Aaron, is go to the COVID-19 text chat section, because I posted really good resources that actually give you the information to answer your question, because length of time doesn't correlate with more dangerous. That's just not.
That's all I need to know.
Yeah, that's not the way the data.
That's all I need to know.
So under the hashtag COVID-19 tab on Discord, I posted some. There's a virologist and a very astute thinker that I really enjoy. The thing I like about him is that he's got a solid foundation in skepticism, and he works in medicine, which is unfortunately a hard thing to find. But he has a very good channel, and he's a great virologist, and he explains. He takes you through the whole process in a very understandable way of how it's developed. These are the possible things you're giving up when you do things a little quicker, and then you start realizing in the end, when you have enough money and resources to really just get something done quickly, that those are most of the hurdles that take the time. It's actually not like a process of watching something in a petri dish for longer. It's more a funding thing typically.
Can I offer a hot take?
Absolutely.
The vaccine won't be the end of the coronavirus. Not by a long shot. It will not be the end. And I think
Probably not, but I think it's going to reduce the impact.
It'll reduce the impact, but even after the amount of vaccines that are ultimately going to be distributed are distributed, I'm probably still going to wear a mask. Because if 2020 taught us anything about America, at least, we got a lot of people who just like to go against the grain just for shits and giggles. And that also includes vaccines. So,
yeah.
I think the only thing I'd worry about with the vaccine, and this is, I mean, for me, I'm pretty young, so I'm not sure. I would weigh the benefits of the vaccine differently than if I were 70 years old. If I were 70 years old, I think I'm getting the vaccine. Of course, essentially, no question.
Yeah. My parents are in their 70s, and they're planning out their days and being like, okay, I get my shot then, and I get my shot then, and they're basing their days off of getting that vaccine because, it means a fucking lot. Well, especially like both my parents have had cancer, so they're both immunocompromised. So it's a really fucking big deal for them,
Yeah, definitely. The only thing that is potentially whatever tests on human subjects that we would normally conduct that are long-term tests with vaccines, like some 10-year study that evaluates future unforeseen consequences of some X vaccine. We would not have that data at this point for the COVID vaccine, which is some degree of risk. I don't know to what extent that's.
Yeah, but I think we naturally take that risk anyways. There's so many drugs in the market that haven't had long-term viability studies done on them yet about what the potential outcome of this drug being on the market is. There were all sorts of opioids that were on the market for the longest time, and eventually they made, we're going to make some that people can't fucking smash up and smoke because that's what people were fucking doing with it, And they didn't know these certain things about this drug, and over time, so with these opioids, we gotta make it this specific way so people can't be freebasing it.
So that's an example then, right? That's an example of something that you would learn through experience.
Over time, yeah, exactly.
Generally, when you release new treatments, there's a battery of FDA protocols that you have to test it for this length of time. I'm not a medical expert, but whatever was whatever tests were ignored or essentially just kind of put to one side for the sake of getting the virus out quickly. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing. That might have been the right thing to do in this case. There is just some amount of extant risk over what you would have had if there were the normal range of tests. So it's not a totally facetious point to make. It's just small amount of unforeseen future consequences is a factor to weigh against whatever risk of getting the virus times your risk of getting killed by the virus. So, like I said, if I'm 70, that's an easy calculation to make. I'm not 70, so it's not as straightforward.
I think one of the things that helps in this regard is, now I don't know which version of the coronavirus vaccine is actually being doled out to the public right now, but I did watch a SciShow video basically explaining what the coronavirus vaccine, one of them, is supposed to do. I do feel like when it comes to this, because of course my argument, which I feel like whoever was speaking kind of sort of maybe defending me in a way, which you're the real MVP if you were. It's mostly the whole idea of the fear of the unknown. That's basically what I'm getting at. But I do believe that can be resolved by simply giving the public an idea as to exactly what. Now, I'm not saying that everybody is a medical expert. Most people aren't medical experts. But if your education was decent enough and you actually understand a little bit about the way the human body works and how the immune system works, if you came up to someone and said, hey, we need to get you vaccinated. But before we do, and before you go on your tangent about I ain't taking no damn vaccine and yada, 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 here's how it works. Here's what it does. And from there, maybe, just maybe, a few more people can make sort of educated remarks regarding whether or not they should take it or not. Because from the one that I heard about, which is pretty much sending harmless copies of the actual virus into your body so that your immune system can look at them and go, you're not good.
Yep.
I honestly don't see many adverse side effects coming down the line 10 years later.
Well,
I don't see them.
That's sort of the basis of pretty much all vaccines. So what a lot of vaccines do is they inject you with a serum of dead viral bodies. So these viruses can no longer reproduce, but they inject them in you, and your body learns, your white blood cells learns, and your body learns the response to those specific cells, those specific RNA viruses, and then you can then protect yourself. That's sort of the fundamental basis of what a vaccine is.
It is somewhat. I think the COVID vaccines, however, like the Pfizer vaccine, is an mRNA vaccine. Those are relatively new, I think.
Those are
new.
wrong.
Yeah. They are new, but understood to a level enough that the scientific consensus is that there's nothing unsafe about it.
Yeah.
Right. Obviously, and still unsafe is going to be a relative term.
Right.
I mean,
we
have to kind of
it's different.
between.
It's different now, Dave, than saying that something is safe to be distributing to humanity versus 50 years ago. Even now, we're on just the shoulders of such giants in medicine that it's just
even 50 years ago, with like shit how faulty it was, it still saved more lives.
Well, that's what I mean. Yeah,
Exactly.
it's like and people when they're starting to wager this thing, when they're starting to talk along the lines of, oh well, there might be some side effects down the line, but then they're continuing to clog their body full of sugar, smoke, alcohol. It's like, honestly, where alcohol factors in on this, trust me, an alcoholic beverage is worse. There's a reason why doctors.
At least those are.
Obese?
At least those risks are known.
You know what's funny? It reminds me of fucking every hardcore vegetarian I've ever known. But oh man, you can't eat meat; it's bad for you. Out a couple hours later, they're doing lines of blow and fucking. It's like, yeah, okay.
That's funny.
Really care because it's what bad for you. Fuck off.
By the way, I have to say, first of all, now that I know that not every vaccine has to take 17 years to properly develop, can we just say kudos to all of the chemists and the engineers all over the planet
Yeah,
came
man.
up with this shit so quick? Like they deserve way more credit than they're getting.
Oh yeah.
Sure, they're paid by their governments, but that's not enough to come up with a vaccine for a global pandemic this quickly. That deserves a Nobel Prize.
People have been putting in the fucking work, man, and you're so right to bring that up.
Not just a Nobel Prize,
but
why aren't those people millionaires? Why
exactly? Why aren't they the billionaires?
Exactly.
It's
they're the ones who deserve it. Sorry, Jeff. But the other thing is, when I look at the coronavirus vaccine and how it's already being distributed, it just makes me go, two things spring to mind. Number one, man, if we put this kind of effort into climate change, we would have figured this shit out years ago. But two, how the hell can we come up? And I know that the reasons are complicated, but I'm saying this in a sort of joking manner. How the hell can we come up with a vaccine for the coronavirus in less than a year, but we still can't figure out HIV?
well, we've done. I mean, they kind of have.
HIV's done.
Yeah, we kind of
Are
have.
you serious?
HIV's done. Yeah,
I was having this conversation with somebody.
Never mind then.
Somebody in the server before. I mean, HIV at this point is essentially you take a pill a day
Right.
type disease,
Yeah.
and it's essentially under control.
Pretty minor,
Like if I had
minor
to
side
choose,
effects.
you're right.
Well,
Like if I
there's
had
also
to choose between, I was gonna say if I had to choose between some moderately dangerous cancer and HIV, I would choose HIV.
Of course.
It's not 1970, right? I mean, it's not a death sentence anymore.
Is
So
there a vaccine for HIV?
no, but there
there-
are well-developed antiretrovirals that essentially keep the vaccine at bay to the point where you're
there are people who have who they say they've stopped taking the antivirals and it doesn't come back. Like they are cured of HIV.
Yeah, there are
Right.
there are cases.
Right.
Yeah.
This is where this issue of like absolute certainty comes in, because we can measure the number of copies of a virus in some milliliter of blood only to the degree that the precision of our instruments allow us to. And so in theory, if even one remains, there can be a proliferation of the virus, and you can so you should never stop taking. But it is also fair to say that I think many physicians are starting to say at this point that if you've been on these antiretrovirals for a certain period of time, if you stay on them, and if your I forget what the name of the actual measurement is, but if your viral load essentially is undetectable, then it's actually safe to have unprotected sex at that point.
When they drop the dosage down dramatically.
Yeah, HIV is a success story. Actually,
Scott's just having a stroke there.
I think drastically is a fantastic word.
I think so.
So basically, forget everything I just said. Then I thought for the longest time that we still didn't have a way of dealing with HIV, but to me now it sounds like we absolutely do. So
yeah, absolutely.
Man, it is amazing what humanity can accomplish when we're not busy arguing over our arbitrary bullshit. Just saying.
Like gender pronouns?
Exactly.
Dude, it's not even just gendered pronouns, because everybody talks about SJWs, but there are also SQWs, status quo warriors, and these are the people on the right who are like fucking just fundamentally fighting for the status quo as well. And that's been going on just as long, So it's not just a matter of like SJWs. It's like you've got to see this thing for what it is, and it's both sides acting like fucking idiots.
So Travis, this is a discussion specifically about the virus, because I'd be interested in discussing what's it gonna. Now I'm an introvert, so my life hasn't changed pretty much at all since the beginning of lockdown. But I'm more interested in those who have just been yearning for physical contact with other human beings. They finally get it again after being isolated for so long. What's that gonna? But if that's not
another
the topic
generation of
conversation,
baby boomers.
Yep.
Dude, I cannot wait to fucking go to a sushi restaurant. I'll tell you that fucking much right now. Man, that's going to be fucking fantastic.
Skip the dishes, man.
So just to answer the question, that the conversation is kind of in the abstract, is more about epistemology, and we are kind of discussing the ways that people come to certain beliefs about contemporary topics, and the virus is just one of those. That's a great example, because there's a lot of people engaging in conspiracy theories, and a lot of people who perhaps ignoring non-trivial points that we know about because we've accelerated the development and that sort of thing, and just but I did kind of want to bring this a little bit back towards epistemology, in the sense that I wanted to ask everybody a question about evidence and what the nature of evidence is. Travis, we had a little bit of a back and forth on this once upon a time on one of your town halls. And I saw you reiterate your conception of evidence in your conversation with that Connectly guy.
Right.
And then I just wanted to ask you, because people these days, you see it all the time, and there have been some aggravating factors like conspiracy theories that essentially turned out to be like the whole Jeffrey Epstein thing. What was the prior probability of that sort of thing?
Yeah, it depends on how deep you're going into that, because the Eric Weinstein conspiracy theory about of what's like Epstein seems to go deeper and deeper every time he has time to sit down and on the mic and start talking about how
I love
deep
listening
this
to
thing.
that guy.
I do too. He's a very interesting man. But
the point that I was going to make is
sorry.
Before that whole thing happened, okay,
right.
if you were to try to convince me with some evidence, some circumstantial style of evidence,
right,
that this was going on, like that, what's his face, the conspiracy theorist guy, the crazy guy,
Alex Jones.
Yeah, Alex Jones was talking about the pedophile elites for like a decade, and I thought he was absolutely insane. Because essentially, the prior probability that I would assign to a hypothesis such as that, where there's a conspiracy operating on a vast scale amongst a lot of interconnected elite politicians or whoever, if you were to tell me that anything like the Jeffrey Epstein Island existed 5 years ago, the prior probability that I would have assigned to something like that was near zero.
Why?
If you're thinking about this in a Bayesian sense. Well, I think that it's, why would it have been near zero?
Yeah, so you're talking about, this is why I like plausibility, but you're saying probability, okay, probability of this happening.
Well, that's happening right now.
You would say you would say I think you would refine and maybe say something, okay, sure, I'm sure there are pedophiles, but I'm not sure there's necessarily an organized ring. And then you might see something emerge that shows, okay, there seems to be, this guy was kind of the guy you would go to if you wanted to touch younger girls or boys.
So if you were to come to me 5 years ago and say, Dave, I've got this idea, and my idea is that there's a organized ring of billionaires and famous people who have some sort of structured means of abusing minor children. It's a pedophile organization that is like detailed.
That's been going on. Because you could call that.
Well, I would have said no way. I would have said I think that probably that degree of organization would require a number of conspirators. These are very public figure. I think it would be uncovered if we would know about it if it existed. To a certain extent, I would assign a very low prior probability to any of these conspiracies because they're just so.
Well, even 5 years ago, though, we knew about the Catholic Church that had been doing the exact same thing.
But I think Dave's going at kind of an ought thinking question here as opposed to what is.
Right, I'm thinking about the prior probability that we would assign to certain hypotheses.
So this is
how those. I don't think you could put probability on that, though.
Yeah. So I'll just say, like, if someone was to come and make that claim to me, I'll say, okay, well, why do you think this? And then if they say, well, I would want to see what their evidence is for thinking that, right?
Perfect. So that's the question I wanted to ask.
Yeah. So and with evidence, it's kind of muddy, but not if someone says scientific evidence. But what people tend to mean by evidence now is any evidence that could be presented as evidence in the court of law, which is not the same thing as what we would count as evidence in the scientific field.
Okay, but what?
I would say that even if it was past the court of law, because there are certain things that people will accept for evidence in the realm of art that would not pass a court of law, but we still understand that as being evidence. Like, you could listen to a song and be like, oh yeah, that song fucking makes me feel this specific way. And everybody can agree with you. And you have evidence to that because everybody agrees with you. But the problem is it's art, it's.
Well, that's what I'm saying. But that's just your subjective taste, Scott, as opposed to the other thing, which was a is claim.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
I don't love the courtroom analogy for evidence, frankly. I think it's abused in a number of contexts.
I agree with you. I think it's abused as well.
When I think about evidence. So Travis, I've heard you say this a couple of times. I asked you once how you define evidence.
Right.
And you said, if I remember correctly, and tell me if you've changed this since then, but you said there's courtroom evidence and scientific evidence.
Well, I would the courtroom maybe because I think people colloquially think about the court. I kind of mean colloquial usage of that term, of colloquial usage of evidence is probably a better way to put it. So that's what I mean by that. But then there's the scientific standard of evidence where someone might think that, like, you know, a Bible and what it says is evidence of the claims that are made in that Bible, but you bring that, and colloquially it might mean that to some people, and it might be evidence to some people, but just shitty evidence. It might be good evidence to some people, but in the realm of science, it's like that's not evidence of what it's claiming to be evidence for.
So what is evidence then? Like, if you had, put a definition on evidence. So preferably without using the term, so that I know that what you're talking about.
It's basically evidence is a demonstration.
A demonstration to me sounds like that if you could demonstrate something, that would just be proof. Certainly, evidence can be less than proof.
Yes. Well, the evidence is like when someone asks for evidence for like the Epstein thing, the child ring thing. This is what I was talking about with the colloquial usage versus science usage, because some people are going to be like, well, look at what happened to Epstein. Well, that's not evidence of an organized ring necessarily. It's potentially evidence of a guy and his friends boinking children, but it's not necessarily evidence of a ring itself. It's just evidence of, we have video footage and some other things to the sign-in forms or whatever to confirm that this girl and Jeffrey Epstein were in the same room together, and she claims that they had sex. Oh wait, we have the sex on the video. Can we tell that that's Jeffrey Epstein? Yeah, we're having video analysts look at it, but it looks like we're 98% sure that is Jeffrey Epstein. And then the defense is going to be like, that can be manufactured, which is true. When someone makes a positive claim, and I say, "Where's your evidence?" and if their evidence is a logical is a logic equation, or that's what I call a demonstration. Anything that anyone would bring to the table, I would consider a demonstration. So if someone says,
my issue with that is that it sounds like your standard of what would qualify something as evidence is, like, especially when you said logical demonstration, that just sounds like a deductive proof. Like if I had, let's say that somebody was killed in the library. Yep. And they were killed we have a murder weapon, and the murder weapon is a really, really heavy book. It's like the autobiography of Travis Pangburn. It's like
probably be pretty short.
Enormous tome. It's just bludgeon somebody on the back of the
Unless
head,
there was a picture of my dong in there, and then it's going to have to be at least 18 pages.
Well, maybe that's part of it. It's enormous, and we don't know who did it, right? So what I was going to say is, let's say my hypothesis is that Mr. Mace Starwalk he's the murderer. Right. He's the guy that took this book and thumped the decedent over the head with it. And now I need to. That's my hypothesis, and I need to have some evidence that would raise the probability. This is how I view evidence. Evidence is a fact about the world, right? That you can show to be true. That raises the probability that some hypothesis is true. It doesn't have to be proof. It doesn't have to make the probability 1. It just has to raise it, even by a hair, and then it qualifies as evidence. If it only raises it by a hair, then it's really, really bad evidence, but it's evidence nonetheless. It's not conclusive evidence. If a fact about the world takes the probability that Mr. Starwalk is the murderer from 50%, let's just say that's the prior probability because he really didn't like this guy who ended up dead or whatever. Whatever reason we have for assigning 50% to the prior. If the fact is able to raise it to 51 or 52 or something, it would count as evidence, but weak evidence, very weak evidence.
I think that's a really good definition of evidence there. I'd agree with that.
That's a Bayesian. Essentially that's the Bayesian epistemology. That's the Bayesian view of evidence.
Yeah. So here, it may have to be taken with a grain of salt because you need to demonstrate. So yes, it's true that if you could make a demonstration or provide the evidence that would make it a hair more probable that it was Mace, then you actually have some evidence. But the thing I think people have the most problem with is they will think that the thing that they've presented does make it more probable by a hair, but it doesn't. That connection is incorrect.
See, well, I think it's all about context. It's all about context with that kind of thing.
That's what I mean. Like if they were to say that, oh, okay, a guy named a guy with the last initial in his last name with S. If we knew that he had an S in his last name and he was definitely that person who killed had S in his last name, that is not evidence that positive that Mace Starwalk was the killer.
Well, it would be evidence. So let's say we knew that the killer had S in his last name. Okay.
Yep, that's not. And what I'm saying, just to be clear, just because Mace Starwalk has S in his last name, it doesn't make it more probable that he was the killer.
Sure, it does.
Incorrect.
Well, let's talk about that.
Sure.
If it were, let's say, okay, so basically, I have.
Hang on, before you go any of this, can I just say it was me. I did it.
Yeah, I knew it.
Ace is over there slashing motherfuckers.
when I'm looking at something, a hypothesis, and I want to know if the evidence that I'm assessing on the hypothesis raises the probability of the hypothesis. I want to know what is the probability that I would observe this data if the hypothesis was true, right? So if the hypothesis was true that Mace Starwalk was the killer, would we know? Like, I don't know how we figured out that the guy has S in his last name, but the probability that the guy would have an S, or his last name would start with S, if Mace Starwalk wasn't the killer, is 0.
So
it's infinitely higher if it's infinitely higher if we know that he has an S in his last name.
So you're talking about Dave. I think you're using probability where you shouldn't be, because I think you're it's not more probable that Mace is, but he's worth investigating to see if there is something there. Because he has S, that doesn't mean it's more probable that he's the killer.
Okay, let's say that
because think of
no
the
idea
vast
who the killer is.
Right.
No clue.
Okay.
So there's 10 billion people on the planet.
Sure.
And everybody has an equal likelihood, essentially, of being the killer. We've no way of assessing it.
Right.
For whatever reason. Obviously, the location would play into that. But let's just say everybody has an equal likelihood of being the killer. So that means the likelihood that Mace Starwalk was the killer is 1 in 10 billion. Okay. Now, if we figure out later that the killer has an S in his last name, everybody that doesn't have or has their last name starts with an S. Everybody that doesn't have an S falls out of that equation. So now it's 1 in a billion or whatever the number of people with S in their last name.
So the
it's
potential
higher now. And if his last name didn't start with S, it would be 0. So the fact that the last name of the killer starts with an S has raised the probability now.
It hasn't raised the probability.
Was the killer.
It didn't raise the probability. It changed the initial sample size.
Probability.
Well, explain what you mean by that.
Well, what I mean by that is that you're no longer dealing with the sample size of the whole world. You're dealing with the sample size of the people that have S in their last name. But that is not
exactly.
That does not mean that Mace Starwalk that it's skeptically sound to make a claim that Mace Starwalk It's now more probable because of this new found thing that Mace Starwalk is the killer.
Well, of course it is, because before we knew this, everybody that whose last name started with P was in the running of the killer, and we just removed these people. So,
but Dave, what Trav is saying is say you had the entire population with a last name that starts with any letter you can think of. Once you reduce it to S, you have to take all those people off. So you can't. You're not comparing those people to it anymore. So it's not the same thing as. So you can't say it's more probable because you're not taking into account these other people.
Well,
say you had 1,000 last name that starts with P, 30 that starts with the last name of S, and you say, okay, it only comes down to the people whose last name starts with S. At that point, you're taking away the other 970 people. So now it's down.
Exactly. We've narrowed it down.
Yeah, you've narrowed the field, but you haven't got you have not gotten closer to being able to add what you were talking about, that fine hair, to any of those people in the S category. You've just changed the sample size of
probability, like the mathematics of probability, that it hasn't changed.
If the probability was 1 in 10 billion before we knew this thing, and it's 1 in 1 billion after we know this thing, then the probability is higher.
No, you've done better to solve, Dave, in the scenario you've painted. You've done better to solve the problem, the ultimate problem of trying to figure out who is the killer.
Exactly. It makes my hypothesis more likely once I figure out that I can rule out anybody whose last name doesn't start with S. Now my hypothesis that Mace is the killer is more likely than it was before I could rule it out.
No, dude.
Can I
need
jump in
evidence positive if you were going to make a claim that Mace Starwalk is the killer. And if your evidence positive was that he had an S in his name, you failed skepticism 101, brother, in my opinion.
Can I jump in here?
What do you mean my evidence positive was that he had an S in his name? I didn't say that. My hypothesis was before we knew the fact that he had an S in his name.
Right. So, I'm just saying
before we figured that out, I want to say that Mace Starwalk is the killer because I don't have any evidence for him above any other than 10 billion people on the planet, right?
No, I'm just saying, Dave, if you were to then say that it is now more likely that Mace Starwalk is the killer because he has an S in his last name. No.
Can I jump in here because I have another way of putting it?
Yeah.
So you're claiming that when you establish that the killer's last name begins with an S, that all of a sudden Mace Starwalk, which I feel bad for this poor fellow.
Sorry, man.
It was the deep voice.
Setting that aside, you're claiming that suddenly the probability of it being Mace Starwalk has gone up. I would say that in certain ways that's true, but in other ways it's absolutely not. In one way, yes. You've reduced your sample size, therefore you have less people to pick from. Therefore, statistically speaking, there is a higher likelihood of Mace Starwalk being the killer because his last name does begin with an S. However,
exactly
that increase in probability is still almost negligible because all you've really done by ruling out anybody whose name doesn't begin with an S is establishing who it isn't.
The S,
exactly.
Getting to the point where you know that the killer's last name begins with an S does not bring you any closer to knowing exactly who that killer is.
Well, the
S still got a large sample size of people who have last name.
The S isn't evidence of murder.
It's not.
It is if we know that the murderer's last name began with an S. Look,
but again, that's why I said that the probability increase from knowing that information is almost irrelevant.
Look, the probability of Mace Starwalk being the killer is 1 or 0. He either was or he wasn't. We're assessing epistemically how we can evaluate what is more likely based on what we know. It's not the actual probability that Mace is the killer. Mace is the killer or he's not. The probability is 1 or 0. This is an epistemic question. We're talking about what are the facts that we have and how well would the hypothesis that Mace is the killer explain these facts versus versus if it was the case that he wasn't the killer. If Mace was,
I agree with all of that. I agree with all that.
Okay.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
the hypothesis is that Mace is the killer. If that's true, then the probability that the killer's last name would start with S is 100%. If it were false, the probability that the killer's last name would start with S is 0%. It would be impossible.
Yeah.
I mean, just to make this like into a reductio, let's say there are only 10 people on the planet with the last name of Starwalk.
No, actually, let's say lower the sample size. There's a room. There's 10 people in that room who could have committed the murder, and only one of them has an S in their last name. Let's
make it two. Let's make it two. Just so
no. Say it's one, and now we know that the killer has an S in their last name. Does that count as evidence now?
If there's only 10 people who could be the killer.
And so only one of them has an S in their name.
And only one of them has an S in their last name. And we know that the killer has an S in their last name.
Does that now become evidence?
If we...
Yeah, but
absolutely.
I think
no, not you. I'm asking Pangburn.
That is not enough evidence to say that person is guilty just because he...
Yeah, I think...
I'm not asking if it's enough evidence or if it's statistically significant evidence.
No, wait a second.
Is it defined as evidence?
We just asserted that the evidence that we're assessing is the fact that in the hypothetical, we know that the killer has S in his last name. Yes. And if the only options are one guy who has S in his last name and a bunch of people who cannot be the killer because they don't have S in their last name, and we know that the killer does, then the probability that the one guy with the S in his last name is the killer goes to 100%. That's the way we construct the hypothetical.
According to Pangburn, probability doesn't make it evidence, so I want to know what his view is. If it's 100% chance.
Well, also, I mean, I think this is a completely... Like, there needs to be more information in this argument, because you could say, okay, the person had a last name of S. Where were they at the time that this murder happened?
But remember, we said the evidence was that we know that the person with the last name of S is the killer. We know that. We're asserting, for the sake of the hypothetical.
So under this hypothetical, Dave, it changes a lot. The sample size changes a lot of what you're dealing with, because now if you have two subjects, you know that it's either or, right?
What do you mean if I have two? If I have two subjects whose last name is S?
Yeah.
No. I think just if you have an argument of information that's either or, I think you're not necessarily taking in all the aspects of it as, like, I mean, that's because we can get down to this level of being like just reducing everything back. Oh, it's either black or white, and we have to decide one. It's black or white, and it could be a color of 1,000 different grays. You know, but somebody's going to say, well, that's gray enough to be black.
We don't always know.
Sorry, Dave. You said one of them has the S in their last name and the other doesn't, right? Out of the two.
Yeah, so the idea is that we have 10 people who could be the killer. Okay. So for the sake of the hypothetical, we only have 10 candidates.
You're changing the hypothetical though.
No, I didn't. There's a whole people. We had 10 people in the room.
No. I'm talking about when we were talking about like humanity.
Well, in humanity, it's the same thing. It's just there's more people who have S who don't have. There's more people, and there's a subset of people that have S in their last name.
Well, look, what you would do is that if you had 10 people, and let's say some number of them, let's say 4 had the letter S and the others didn't, and you knew the person who killed the guy, like for no shadow of a doubt, you knew that they had the letter S in their name. Like you just had that information.
That's the evidence we're assessing. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so what you would do? No, hold on. So what you would do is you would eliminate everybody whose name does not begin with an S. You would just say, like, you would just not even assign a probability to them. You would just say it's like,
exactly.
And then you would do the number. You would do for each one of the people with the letter S. You would do 1 over the number of people, so like 1 over 4. And then as you get new information, you would just add that to the Bayesian calculus until finally you get the most probable answer.
Right, and my definition of evidence is anything that raises the probability that a hypothesis is true. So let me see if I can make this clear, because so my definition of evidence is anything that raises the probability that a hypothesis is true. So ideally, I have some set of candidate hypotheses beforehand, and then I come to some evidence, and then I readjust my probabilities of those candidate hypotheses, and I have a posteriori probability after the evidence. After assessing the evidence, I've changed the probabilities that I put on the hypotheses. Right? They're different now than they were before I looked at the evidence. So it's like if I thought that Travis was the murderer and I had a 10% chance assigned to it beforehand, the second that I see his fingerprints on the murder weapon, that raises my confidence in the probability that he is the murderer up to, say, 90%. Or whatever it was. Because it raised it from 10 to 90, that's what qualifies it as evidence. And so if I have 10 people in the room who could be the murderer, and 2 of them have a last name that starts with S, and so at this point, I'm just 1 out of 10. Any one of them could be the murderer.
Let's keep it simple. Let's just say there's only one person in the room with an S
so
in
you
their
just
name.
you would just do what I said, right? That's what you would do. Yeah.
Did we lose Dave?
So to confirm, Pangburn, do you think that if there's only one person with an S in their name, and we know the murderer has an S in their name, that we don't have any evidence that it was them?
No, it's 100%.
That's not what that's not what I said, Mace. I said once the hypothetical, once you lower the sample size into this area where we can actually use logic, reason, and skepticism to determine that, we actually know this piece of information, and the sample size is so small, we have the killer. You don't operate with the same. Like once you change the sample size of anything, you're operating under a different scenario. So you adjust based on that. But if you're talking 10 billion, and then we're talking, we have 1 billion people I'm gonna run out of time in this game. Screw shit. If you run you get it down to 10 billion people with S in their name. Sorry. I'm just going to move these quickly. I got 3 seconds. I'm fucked. Never mind. I ran out of time. I got too sucked into the conversation. Okay, I'll just let it run out. You win, buddy.
If the probability of something is 0, can it still happen?
No.
The probability. So I'm like lagging here for some reason. There we go.
Saying the probability is 0 means that it won't happen.
Well, just because something has a probability of 0 doesn't mean it's impossible, right?
Yeah. So
that might be true.
Yeah. Talking about possibility and impossibility, I'll reference I think the existence of the matrix hypothesis makes everything possible, essentially. When it comes to, certainty, try to get to 99.9999, but it's hard to escape that, the matrix hypothesis. I'm hearing like chips stacking or something, like poker chips.
Sorry, I might be on the keyboard.
Biggest problem that I have with this whole idea of possibility, likelihood, whether something happens or not is, we are, in a more general sense, we are limited because we are creatures that look for patterns. That's just what our brains are designed to do. And things that are even well established in something like science, where we say, okay, this is what a galaxy does, this is what a galaxy is. Why do we say this? Well, the evidence for this is the fact that every galaxy we look at, this is how it works in one way or another. So the likelihood that the galaxy could have any other properties other than these is just not possible. and then we find out, oh wait, but it is possible, and now we have to completely redefine the way we think of things. We are slaves to our brains in that regard because we are designed to look for patterns. And if we don't see the patterns, all of a sudden it's not possible, even when it might be.
Well, not necessarily, because even in the example, you bring up two different forms of evidence. You bring up empirical evidence of us viewing something and saying, okay, we can see our own galaxy like this, and then deductive evidence of saying, difference between empirical and deductive evidence.
I honestly don't even think that the deductive reasoning can really be evidence for the reason I pointed out.
Did you
to claim that the evidence for something is the fact that we keep seeing it that way? If the likelihood, if there's a possibility that it could change, then that's not really evidence then.
Well, it was so the very idea comes from like dudes like Galileo and stuff who watched the motions of the planets in the night sky. They could predict where things were going to be after they had enough calculations, and that's where this the idea of being able to deduce what is actually going on. So deductive reasoning or deductive evidence is 100% legitimate in my opinion.
Yeah,
I just believe that it can't apply to everything. Like there are certain places where deductive reasoning cannot serve as evidence just because of the nature of deductive.
Well, absolutely, yeah. It's like neither of the reasonings are 100%. So you have to start using different. You have to combine everything together to get to a final point of view.
Yeah, I don't know what happened. Dave, did he get disconnected?
I don't know. He went mute and then he's gone.
I'm sure he'll stop.
He was making too much sense in Discord kicked
him. Yeah, so just to reiterate my problem with when we bring the strained hypothetical that I initially proposed, kind of referring to the vast sample size of how many people have the last S starting last name as evidence that we know. It's like once you reduce that down and keep reducing it down, sure, the skeptic is going to look at that and say, oh, okay, we have 5 left who have S as their last name. Let's get them together in a room. We now have the killer in the room. You can apply.
It has no application to the real world, though.
Right. Yeah. So, but the reason why the thing I think is applicable is my initial hypothetical before it was changed, where someone might say, "Oh, well, we have definitive evidence to know that the killer has a last name starting in S." So then what I'm trying to say is just because someone has a last name starting with S, you are not reasonable to look at them and say, it is now more probable that you are the killer because you happen to have the last name that starts with an S. It's just, it only works.
Wait, why?
So it only, in my hypothetical that I set up, the point was to show that you don't say, okay, they have the killer we know had blonde hair, and any blonde haired person you come up against, oh yeah, it's more probable that person is the killer. That's not the way skepticism works, and this is why skepticism is a mechanism that sits above all of your other rules and laws and everything else, and questions and continues to question them, and adapts based on separating bullshit from reality as more information's introduced. So yeah, we can hear you now, Dave.
Damn it, motherfucker!
We can hear you.
Fucking. Oh.
Also, if I can just say, the idea of saying when you're dealing with, obviously this is sort of the courtroom evidence that I know that Travis is that big of a fan of being used so widespread, and I can definitely see why now. Because when you're talking about the idea of saying, okay, well, we know that the murderer has an S in the last name, my initial thought is to go, you can't do any better than that. How about fingerprints? How about instead of simply reducing your sampling size, where you still have way too many options to pick from, to the point where simply looking at one person and going, you have an S in your last name, it's more likely that you're the killer. No, it's not. It's absolutely not. You're either the killer or you aren't. Why not start your evidence with something that is going to point at someone and go, you are the killer? Like, I don't know, fingerprints. When you start with something so vague, that's when you go into the rabbit hole.
All right, but Aaron, you just said a second ago, you're either the killer or you're not, right? Obviously, yes. I agree with that. So the actual probability in like the ontological probability that you are the killer is either 100 or 0.
Or 0,
I mean, so, but we don't really know what that is. So this whole conversation, like this whole process, is an epistemic process. We're just trying to take the things that we do know and see how likely it is that something we don't know is true. So when we're varying the weights on the hypotheses, obviously for any hypothesis, it's either just true or false. I mean, the probability is 1 or it's 0. I mean, for every hypothesis or proposition that you could come up with, the probability is just 1 or 0. Well, give me a proposition or a hypothesis about the world that really doesn't have a probability of 1 or 0. Like if we had omniscient, like the way the world actually is. Like every proposition that you can come up with is either true or false. That's the law of excluded middle.
I don't agree with that, because there are certain cases when you're dealing with anything objective, such as a murder. Someone, if it's a murder, someone killed them. They either killed them or they didn't. That's 100 or 0.
Yeah.
But when you're dealing with things like that are abstract, just to say that anything is 100% true or 100% not true,
he's talking
that
in the
doesn't work, because you're dealing with things that are you're dealing with things that can vary wildly based on perspective. So there are a lot of hypotheses that are absolutely can be half true and not true.
Yeah, Aaron, what Dave's talking about is that if we were to actually, let's say, watch an event occur, we would know, we would have the definitive answer. So if someone would have made a claim like the Colosseum, is built, that's either a true. It's either true or false.
It's either true or it's not. Right. Well, yeah.
Or you know.
Okay. Perfect.
Yeah.
So everything's either true or false. Ultimately, the probability is 1 or 0 because it is true or it is false. But we don't know in this context, right? We're trying to assess the probability. And this is an epistemic question. It's how do we know? How confident are we? When should we believe something? This is epistemology. Obviously, everything is ultimately like true or false. Like, I mean, any proposition that you could come up with. Travis was the murderer. It's either true or false. So, Travis was not the murderer. It's either true or false. Dave is a dumbass. That's either true or, I mean, it's true or false. I mean, there you go. So we have some difference of opinion. But I really... Go ahead, Trav.
Oh, I was just going to say, what I use the term plausibility. I'm losing my camera.
Can't hear you. Can't hear you at all.
Oh, weird.
I have 250 megs a second, so it shouldn't be me.
No, he cut out.
Okay.
Can you guys hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Oh,
now.
Yeah.
Good.
I was just going to ask you, Dave, why don't you ever use plausibility?
That's what I mean when I'm talking about probability.
Because plausibility includes using reason, right? So it's a combination of reason and probability. So it's like where I think you failed in interpreting my hype. Can you guys still hear me, or am I dying?
Yeah, you're fine. I may have cut out during your hypothetical.
But I think my hypothetical was to was, you know, I'm essentially talking about plausibility, like leaving.
God damn it!
Am I cutting in and out? There's something weird happening with
I think you're fine right now. Go ahead. Unless I've just cut out.
It's my
Can people hear me?
My camera was.
No, Pangburn is cut out.
I think we all sort of cut out right there.
I think Discord's fucking with us.
The Canadian Wi-Fi connection is just.
Yeah, it's actually, we leave it up to the beavers to build big Wi-Fi dams, and that's what powers everything.
All right, let me see. I don't think I've been clear enough with what I'm trying to say. So, let me see if I can say this a little bit more succinctly and a little bit clearer. So, my definition of evidence is it's an epistemic question, and what would make something evidence in an epistemic sense is the following definition. That's what I'm trying to say. Obviously, the hypothesis for anything is a proposition, and it's either 1 or it's 0. If I cut out now, I can see other people.
No, I can hear you.
No, you're good.
Okay. So the proposition for anything, obviously, ultimately, ontologically, like the way that reality actually is, any proposition that I utter, the probability is 1 or 0. If I say that M theory is the correct model of reality, I have no way of assessing that, but the probability is 1 or 0. Anything I could say, the probability is 1 or 0. That's not the question that we're trying to discuss. Obviously, I think we mostly agree on that. The question's an epistemic question. It's when we don't know something, like whether or not. Let's just do a new example. Let's say the hypothesis is that Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson would beat Dave in a boxing match. That's the hypothesis.
Okay.
Now, my definition of evidence, really quickly, is any fact about the world that I would come to learn, right, that would change the probabilities that I put on my hypothesis. So I have some probability that I have in my head, an epistemic probability, not the actual probability, which is 1 or 0. But just something that I assign to it, how likely it is, based on my background information, what I know about science and the world and frequency of events, all of that information that I know builds into the prior probability of my hypothesis. So I know that Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson is a behemoth who is on steroids and could probably kill most people with 1 punch. And so the probability that he would win in a boxing match against this unknown Dave guy, I'm just going to say, I'm going to give him like 99%. I mean, I think he would beat 99% of people. That's my epistemic probability. I don't know. I'm not going to say 99. That's hyperbolic. Let me say 90. So right?
Yeah. So Dave,
far, right?
You're talking about evaluating the likelihood of something, the probability of something, as opposed to as opposed to demonstrating claims.
Well, yeah. So, because
it sounded like you were
in the context of evidence, though.
Yeah, because what you're talking about, assigning a probability or plausibility to something, is the term I would use. But so you know. Is it plausible that The Rock Dwayne Johnson would kill you in a couple punches? I think that's you would be reasonably justified to say, okay, based on what I know about Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson and my own technique, physics, everything, that he's gonna do away with me quite easily. So that's plausible. So
that's my prior probability before I come to anything that might be considered evidence. I just have an 80%. Let's say it's 80% for Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, and you know nothing about me. It's just that Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson is such a behemoth that he's probably. I'm just a randomly selected individual from the ether.
Yeah. So there is a little bit of something here where you. Okay, when you say I don't get to know anything about you, for
the sake of the example,
okay.
Say I'm just a randomly selected guy named Dave. Pretend it's not me, just some guy named Dave.
Some guy named Dave, but I would want to, before I can put any probability on it, Dave, I need to know something about Dave.
Do you though? Because you know that Dwayne, you know something about.
Yes, I do.
Yes, you do.
Okay, that's
two sides
all right. Well,
to the story.
And the reason.
Let's talk about that then.
Yeah.
Because I think that you don't necessarily need. So if I know that Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson is in the 99th percentile of human beings for strength and punch strength, I know that he's probably going to beat up anybody that's like the average Joe, right? I mean, that's probably. I mean, I would. So if you were to, let's say this is a boxing event and there's a betting line.
Yeah.
So I've just been randomly selected from the population of 9 billion, whatever. Just some doofus named Dave.
Okay, you've added some information though, right? So now that we know it's a random selection to fight Mike Tyson, right?
Sure. Yeah, it's a random selection.
Yeah. Okay. Random selection to fight Mike Tyson.
Let's go with Mike Tyson.
Okay.
Let's go with Mike Tyson. So let's have a hypothesis about who's going to win the fight. I'm going to say Mike Tyson's going to win the fight, even though I don't know. Look, maybe the random selection ends up being like the world's strongest man or something.
Yeah.
But the probability of that is going to be like 1 in not 10 billion, or like very, very low.
Yeah.
More than likely, Mike Tyson's going to kick this random guy's ass.
Yep.
Right.
Yep. True.
Okay. So
the only difference with that, because we started off, Dave, and I want to point out this interesting difference.
Yeah.
When you actually say it's going to be an individual named Dave, when we didn't know it was like a random selection, that's why my skepticism kicked in and said, I'm sitting in a state of I don't know the probability yet.
Okay, that's fair. Yeah. So let's say we just know it's a random guy selected from the ether. Okay, this is the scenario. We have a random guy selected to fight Mike Tyson. Okay.
Yeah.
And I'm going to say, okay, let's frame a hypothesis before coming to any evidence of things that we'll learn that may or may not be evidence, right? Let's frame a hypothesis that Mike Tyson wins based on our background information about things we already know. So Mike Tyson's like one of the greatest boxers of all time. Mike Tyson's very strong, right? Let's say we know that he's in the 90th percentile of strength for human beings. I'm going to be pretty confident that Mike Tyson's going to win this fight. Not 100%, because, again, I don't know who's going to get selected. It might be, for all I know, it might be the current #1 reigning champion.
So, Dave, I have something interesting here for you to maybe consider. Okay. In this situation where... Like I agree with you fully, and I know what you're saying. It's reasonable in this situation to come out and make a claim to say, I think it's quite probable that Mike Tyson will win this fight, because it's going to be very hard for the random selection process to pick someone that could beat him. Can you guys still hear me? Yeah.
That's my epistemic. That's my epistemic assessment.
Yes, it's your epistemic assessment. So that's your epistemic assessment. Now, if someone is to make the claim Mike Tyson is going to win this fight,
is that different than the hypothesis that I was? My hypothesis was that Mike Tyson will win the fight. Right?
It kind of sounded like you were saying that Mike Tyson was likely to win the fight, not that he was going to win the fight.
Well, I'm saying the hypothesis is that Mike Tyson will win, and I'm assessing the likelihood that hypothesis is true.
There's more to that, though, Dave. Your hypothesis changed to Mike Tyson is going to win against a randomly selected fighter, and I think that's
my hypothesis.
Yeah.
That's my hypothesis.
Yeah. No, I'm saying you got to add the random. That random part is very important to my ears, at least.
So the background scenario is that we have Mike Tyson. He's occupying slot 1 in the ring, and slot 2, who he's going to be fighting, is just some randomly selected guy, some totally randomly generated individual on the planet.
You're essentially talking about betting, Dave. Like gambling is a very
believe it or not, it's a very good way of establishing what the epistemic probabilities people have on things, right? Yeah. And it's actually kind of how I'm not a philosopher, but I listen to a lot of stuff and I read a lot of stuff, and I think it's modern epistemologists go about assessing beliefs this way. They look at what bets, like what odds would you take that X is true? And you can calculate a probability based on some betting range that you would take, how confident you are that X is true. It's like, what odds would I actually bet that, some hockey team will win the cup? It's, if I'll take a 1-to-1 odds, I'm pretty confident in that proposition. I mean,
right.
It's just a way of assessing things. So basically, to get back to the scenario, randomly selected guy versus Mike Tyson. Before I come to anything that I might define as evidence, okay, we haven't gotten to that yet. I have some hypothesis and some probability epistemically that I assign to the hypothesis that Mike Tyson will win in this fight.
Which is based on your understanding of the evidence of reality.
Correct. It's based on my whatever background information I already have before I come to any evidence later.
Sure.
So my understanding of physics, of who Mike Tyson is, of his history, of his weight, his age, everything.
Of humanity.
So
yeah.
So if this was a real situation, like if this was actually happening, I might take if there were betting odds.
I'm putting $1,000 on his opponent just in the sheer chance that he might win.
well, it depends on what the odds are.
And you win the lottery.
If the odds are like,
well, I'm just saying that the lottery.
You wouldn't do that if the odds.
The odds are going to be
exactly what I'm trying to say, right?
But the odds are going to be 95% in favor of.
Exactly.
Tyson. Yeah.
So if the odds were just 1-to-1, you would not put $1,000 on Tyson's opponent.
No.
Okay. So that means that your epistemic assessment of the likelihood that his opponent will win is not 50%. It's lower than that. You're not willing to take a 50-50 bet.
Yeah. Well, I mean,
right?
I mean, you don't take 50-50 bets because it pays out the same, right? It's like
right. So let's say it's 50, 49, 51.
Yeah.
You're still not taking that bet.
No, you might make a few cents if you win.
Right.
Yeah.
But if it were, 1,000,000-to-1, I would take that bet. Right? You would take that bet
throwing some money towards the random.
Yeah, like 1,000,000-to-1.
Definitely.
I'm taking the bet.
Definitely.
Okay, so our confidence, our prior probability in the hypothesis that Mike Tyson will win, right, is higher than 50%, but it's not as high as 99.999999, whatever it would be not take 1,000,000-to-1.
Yep.
Okay, so it's somewhere in between there, and we could, if we sat down for 10 hours, figure out pretty much exactly what range our confidence was, or like 70 to 80, I'd take this range of bets. I put this much amount of money down on this guy. This is how epistemologists kind of assess people's confidence in beliefs, right? So, okay, so let's say that it's 80%. Well, let's say it's 90% for Mike Tyson. That's based on what we know beforehand. We think there's a 90% chance. That's the bet we would take, essentially. The equivalent of those odds that would give us anything. That's our assessment. 90% chance that Mike Tyson wins. We'll take something that gives us a better payout. That's what it means to think there's a 90% chance that Mike Tyson wins, essentially. We agree on that.
Yeah.
So, okay, good. So my definition of evidence is going to be, evidence has to be for a proposition. It can't just be a fact.
Yes.
There's a fact that I'm looking at a computer right now.
Yeah.
That's not evidence. I mean, it is evidence for a whole range of propositions.
If you made a claim that I'm looking at a computer right now, that you would want to record that as evidence.
Absolutely. That would just be proof.
Yeah.
I mean, if the hypothesis is I'm looking at a computer and the fact is I'm looking at a computer, that's a deductive proof. I mean, that's the best evidence you could have. But there's other propositions that it wouldn't count as evidence for at all, like the hypothesis that Jesus rose from the dead. Like, what does the fact that I'm looking at a computer right now have to do with the fact that Jesus rose from the dead? Nothing. It doesn't change the probability at all. It doesn't change my assessment of the probability at all. So there are some propositions that a fact will count as evidence for in varying degrees, and some that it won't count at all for, and some that it will count against as evidence against in varying degrees. So
so you're talking about the problem of the preponderance of evidence required to believe that someone went to the grocery store today, and the preponderance of evidence required that I sprouted wings and flew myself to Australia last night and came back.
Well, in a sense, I'm not really talking about what it would mean to believe something, because like if I'm like 5149, would I say I believe it?
Because we're talking about evidence.
Let's leave the term. Yeah, evidence. Well, I'm giving you my definition. So evidence would be something that makes that after I look at this new fact, it raises my new assessment of the probabilities is different now after I've looked at this new fact. So if my hypothesis is that Jesus rose from the dead, and the new fact is I'm looking at a computer screen, I'm not going to change my probability that I have assigned that Jesus rose from the dead based on the fact that I've now learned that I'm looking at a computer screen. They just have no relationship to each other. Even though one's a fact and the other one's a proposition, there's a link between the two that needs to be instantiated before we can say one is evidence for a proposition. And I'm saying that link is that it raises the probability that I'm going to assign to it epistemically.
Yes, and then someone will say, you know, let's say in the Bible and Jesus thing, someone will say, well, this Bible is evidence and it does raise the probability. And then I would say, why do you think that? So then it's up to the person presenting to demonstrate why it raises the plausibility.
Yes, in a sense. Well, I think that, okay, let's put that to one side for a second. Because there are issues with conclusions and how after we multiply the probabilities and all that. I'm just saying that if something did raise the probability, my epistemic assessment of, maybe, you know, let's say just assume it's a justified assessment. Like if the new fact raises my epistemic probability, say I'm a smart guy, of some proposition, it would count as evidence for that proposition. And the strength of the evidence would be determined by how much it rose the probability, my epistemic probability in the proposition. So
sure.
If just really quickly, like if my proposition is Jesus rose from the dead, and the fact is I'm looking at a computer screen, doesn't change my epistemic probability at all. If the fact is, if the proposition is Dave has a headache right now, and the new fact is Dave's looking at a computer screen, that might change it a little bit, because computer screens, based on my background information about computer screens causing headaches, right?
Right.
And if the proposition is Dave's looking at a computer screen right now, then the fact that I'm looking at a computer screen right now would just shoot it all the way to 100. It would be evidence and proof at the same time, right? So that's how I define evidence.
It would be evidence that you're looking at the screen, but it's not evidence that it is causing your headache.
Well, that wasn't my hypothesis. My hypothesis was just that I have a headache.
Yeah. No, I'm just, the hypothesis, I have a headache. So
let's get back to Mike Tyson example before we start parsing examples.
Sure.
So let's say that so we have a prior probability that we've agreed on. It's 90% that Mike Tyson wins this fight. And now we're going to start assessing new facts that start to come out about his opponent. And let's say that one of these facts is that his opponent is able to deadlift 2,000 pounds, or he's this just comes out, hits the news, randomly selected Mike Tyson opponent is able to deadlift 1,000 pounds. I don't know I'm not into this, so I don't know what the world record is, but let's just say it's like fairly significant. It's like, whoa, that's pretty significant. The betting line is going to change, right? And we're going to be fairly unhappy, because the betting line is going to go way down, and we took odds that were probably not as good. So I'm going to say that. Remember the beforehand, the guy was randomly selected. Now I'm saying the guy who's randomly selected can deadlift 1,000 pounds.
So he's a strong,
I'm not going to make it very strong guy. It's not going to be as high as my epistemic probability in the proposition that Mike Tyson wins this fight is not going to be as high as it was before I knew the guy could deadlift 200 pounds. It's going to be higher, right? I'm sorry, it's going to be lower, not higher. Yeah. Now that I know the guy can...
Like, I'm just thinking of what would happen with Vegas. Like, Vegas is, it's going to be a few points, but I don't think it's going to be that drastic of a change because it's a boxing match, right? The boxing experts are
it's
going
a
to say
boxing
that
match,
this
so-
is, you know, this the kind of strength involved here in powerlifting
Right.
and likely some other is really going to be insufficient for this guy trying to, you know, dodge or
Sure.
move around the ring for potentially
Right.
a long.
That's all going to
quite
factor
a-
into it.
Yeah.
You know, but if I start upping the weight, like, oh, he's the world record holder in benching, deadlifting, and curls.
Well, why don't we say
Now the problem.
yeah.
I mean, you know, now the probability is going to go way down.
Here's
Mike
an
Tyson's
interesting
fight.
one.
Mike Tyson's a 40-year-old boxer in a weight class that he hasn't been training. You know what I mean?
Well,
I mean, it
yeah.
is going to change the epistemic probability.
It does change, and some things will be, you know, more significant than others, because then something like here's one that's even weirder with Vegas. Mike Tyson just announced he's splitting up with his short-term girlfriend, who he felt he was publicly noted as feeling quite strongly about their love. How's this going to affect his performance? Is it good for Mike Tyson or bad? It's interesting to see how when the numbers actually hit Vegas, when people are, it seems intuitive that this might be bad for him, that he's going to be down in the dumps and like feeling like crap about losing his love. But for a guy like Mike Tyson, maybe not necessarily.
Hard to know. But so maybe we wouldn't change our epistemic probability at all in that sense.
Right.
And if we wouldn't change the epistemic probability at all, then I wouldn't classify it as evidence. But if we would change the epistemic probability,
evidence for what
qualifies some. Well, whatever the
because there has to be a
proposition is.
Yeah, whatever the proposition. Yeah, you're right. Yeah, as long as there is because anytime people start talking about evidence without a proposition to put it to,
we need a proposition and a discrete proposition. So the proposition is Mike Tyson will win.
Although something to consider here is that with the scientific method, sometimes we have in the past come across things that we just basically collect what it is, and we don't have any model set for it yet. So there is something to say about just purely coming across something and it is evidence for something. It is evidence of something. We haven't put it to a proposition yet.
Right. So, but if we're going to say it is evidence for this proposition, what I'm saying is it's got to raise or lower the epistemic probability after we see the evidence. That's how I'm defining evidence. So basically, I have a prior proposition and a confidence level in it. 90% chance confidence, my epistemic confidence in the proposition that Mike Tyson will win this fight. Now there's a fact that I come to learn. Okay. Yep. And if this fact raises the probability that I epistemically assign to Mike Tyson winning the fight, it counts as evidence for that proposition. And if it lowers my epistemic probability that Mike Tyson wins the fight, it counts as evidence against the proposition.
Yeah. So and so I agree with you fully on this.
Good.
Where you and I, the reason why I use when I use this colloquial usage of evidence versus scientific is because I assume you're wanting to say that we should just use one phrase, right?
Oh, not necessarily. I'm just giving you my concept of evidence.
Oh, okay.
So, and then if you have a different one,
you're talking about the fine details of exactly like what people are doing anyway of what is, and because someone will ask, well, why is that evidence enough for you to believe that thing? Because it might actually be some evidence. For instance, if someone's if someone
different.
Sorry?
Like belief would be like after because we're going to have multiple candidate explanations, right? This is a binary hypothetical. It's Mike Tyson or this other randomly selected doofus.
Yeah.
Well, now we know he would bench press. He has got the world record in every weightlifting category.
Yeah.
You know, but before it was just Mike Tyson versus this randomly selected doofus, right? Now, after we learn about the weightlifting records, our epistemic probability in Mike Tyson is lower. It's not 90, it's 60% in the proposition that Mike Tyson will win this fight. That's why it counts as evidence against the proposition that Mike Tyson will win this fight, because it's taken our prior probability, our epistemic prior probability, and it's lowered it, right? And if it were to raise it, it would count as evidence for. If it were to If it were to do nothing at all, then it wouldn't count as evidence for or against. It would just be irrelevant. But like the thing with my screen and Jesus, like they have no relationship to each other. Good.
Yep.
So that's how I view
evaluating
evidence.
plausibility.
So if we have 10 people in the room who are the only people in the universe that could be the murderer, 2 of them have a last name that starts with S.
Yep.
And my proposition is that Mace Starwalk was the murderer. I'm just going to say, well, let's say I have no background information for my prior. It's just, I know there's 10 people. He's one of those 10. I have no information. It's 1 out of 10. It's 10%. That's my confidence in the prior probability. Now, if I come to learn this new fact that the killer definitely had the letter S as the first letter in his last name, now I can rule out 8 other people, but not Starwalk. Now there's only 2 people in the room, and my epistemic confidence in the fact that Mace Starwalk is the killer is 50% because it's 1 out of 2.
Yep.
So it's gone from 10 to 50 in light of this new fact.
Yep.
And that's why it counts as evidence for the proposition that Mace Starwalker is the killer, because it raised my epistemic probability. That's how I'm viewing.
Yeah, so I think that's a mistake. I think
but we agreed all the way up to
the point because when you got here, this is where skepticism comes in to say, are we separating bullshit from reality here? So if someone says okay, the proposition is Mace Starwalk is the killer, and I say, well, what's your evidence? Well, we have 2 people left.
Let's talk about our prior probability first, because it's 1 out of 10, right? There's only 10 people who could be the killer,
yes,
and Mace Starwalk's one of them. So it's 1 out of 10. That's our prior.
Yep.
Right? In the proposition. Okay, good. Go ahead.
Yeah. No, and I'm just saying when it comes to making the claim, if someone's going to say, okay, we got these 2 guys left, going to make the claim Mace Starwalk is the killer, and then I say, okay, where's your evidence that it was actually Mace? You say, well, he is one of them.
But what's your epistemic probability now? Because there's only 2 people, so it's 50%.
It is 50-50 because we have no other information.
So it's gone from 10 to 50, and we agreed a moment ago that is what qualifies something as evidence.
Yeah, but this is where skepticism kicks in and says, where is the evidence that someone just made a claim that this person is the killer? What is the evidence to demonstrate that he is the killer? And someone says, well, he is one of the people left.
When is the person making the claim?
Well, this is the
person
point,
making the claim before we come to the evidence, or after?
Well, that's what I want to know, because that's what matters to me, is what we're putting the evidence to. So because I think the language or the argument proposed is important here, because inevitably in the end someone's going to have to take on the burden of proof and prove, right?
Of course. So let's leave the issue of belief to one side, because I want to get to that in a second. But like, if we've already whittled it down to 2 people, and our confidence in Starwalk being the killer is now 50% because he's one of the 2, and we have no other information. If someone comes along and says Mace is the killer, I'm going to want it. Okay, you're confident in this proposition. Where's the evidence to raise probability? If he just reiterates the fact that he has an S in the last name, that's not going to change my assessment, because they both have S's in their last name. It's 50-50. It was 50-50 before. You brought this new piece of evidence. It's 50-50 afterward. So it doesn't count as evidence either direction. But if there were a bunch of people in the room who I thought could be the killer beforehand, and I can rule them out based on your new information, such that the confidence level in Mace being the killer has gone from 1 out of 10 to 1 out of 2, that is exactly the definition of Bayesian evidence that I was proposing and that we just agreed upon in the Mike Tyson context, is a new fact that changes the epistemic probability. That's what I'm talking about. It doesn't mean we believe. Belief is another thing. Let's leave that to one side. It's just about what is or isn't evidence, and I think this is important issue to tackle before we go forward.
Yeah, well, I think, but I think we agree on the evidence. I was just talking at the end there of how one must apply the evidence of what is here, and how it must at some point someone's going to actually have to make a claim, and and you know the claim's going to require evidence to substantiate it.
So let's say we've already had this new evidence, we've whittled it down to 2 people. So it was evidence for Mace, but now it's not evidence for Mace over this other guy. It was evidence for Mace over these other 8 people who didn't have, who didn't have an S in their last name. But it's not evidence for Mace over this other guy because it doesn't change the epistemic probability. So we're just being consistent with the definition. And if this is all we had to go on, this is the only thing, I don't believe that Mace is the killer because I'm not more than 50% confident in the facts that Mace is the killer. I don't believe either of them are the killer. And this just has to do with, and this is like far more, I don't even know where to put my threshold for belief. Like if I'm 51% confident that Mace is the killer, when I say I believe it, that's kind of like, I don't know, like what's the threshold epistemically to say I believe something? I have no idea.
Well, I think from an epistemic perspective, I'm not when it comes to belief, obviously belief just has to do with people becoming convinced of the truth of the proposition. They believe it to be true. So belief, you're obviously going to think about plausibility. You yourself, Dave, you're going to have to be convinced in that way in order for you to utter a belief.
Yeah, if I were to say I believe that Mace is the killer, that would entail that I have some degree of confidence in that proposition sufficient to warrant belief. Like, it wouldn't have to be 100.
Yeah, no, confidence is a good way to put it because exactly. you might be confident for terrible reasons. Like you may have a justification, but it can be a very bad justification.
Right. So, it could be it could be a terrible justification, which means it could be terrible evidence. Like, let's say that Mace and the guy who he killed had an angry conversation on Facebook once. Like, I don't even know how to assess that. Like, maybe it raises it by 1 hair and I would count it as evidence, but wholly lacking, minimalistic, insufficient, pathetic evidence. But if it did raise the
welcome to the world of quantum physics.
Yeah, I don't understand quantum physics, despite what I've read in books about it. It's just not. It's insane.
Yeah, but those levels, those factors on that level, 1 or 2% here, it's like.
But maybe I figure out that the guy who died was sleeping with Mace's wife. Now that's going to raise my epistemic probability, not to 100, but higher than where it was before. I mean, if there's only 2 people, it's either Mace or this other guy, and he was sleeping with Mace's wife. Yeah. And that's all the information I have to go on.
Yeah, and instead of
epistemic probability raised counts as evidence.
And instead of epistemic probability raised, if we're talking colloquially, my suspicion is raised.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So now we get to this exactly. So I think we agree actually on what evidence is. And
yeah.
I mean, if we go back to all the people in the world, I mean, it's just an extrapolation of the same concept. It was 1 in 10 billion before.
Yeah.
Now instead of going from 10 to 2, we've gone from 10 billion to 1 billion. So it's gone from 1 in 10 billion to 1 in 1 billion. Counts as evidence, but it's still, I don't believe it. I certainly don't believe it.
Right.
I mean, we're talking about evidence that got us from 0.0001 to 0.0001 or whatever.
You know why I think I have a knee-jerk reaction when we boil these things down and we talk about epistemic plausibility is because a lot of people confuse this and then they apply it to belief, and then all of a sudden people start believing crap on shit. They'll think of these hypotheticals and they'll be like, "Oh, I think I got something here." It's like, no, you're playing with possibility and plausibility and.
So when we get into these more hairier situations, we really have to look. If we don't it's really obvious where the guy is sleeping with Mace's wife. I mean, that we know a lot about the probability that the percentage of murders that are, passion crime, so that we have background information that is really, really useful to raise that probability. But if we're talking about a situation where it's harder to assess our background, we may not be able to determine whether something is evidence or not. And when it comes to evidence for one thing over another, it depends on what the prior probability of the hypothesis is.
Yes.
Like, let's say we have hypothesis A and hypothesis B, right? And let's say hypothesis A is that Dave locked, let's say I forgot to lock my door before I go to bed, and I wake up in the morning and my door is locked. And hypothesis A is that I just forgot that I did it and I actually locked the door. And that's how my door got locked. I'm just forgetting about it. And hypothesis B is that I have a magical, imaginary guardian angel that locked my door for me before I went to bed. Okay. Now, both of these hypotheses explain the data equally well, right? On both of the hypotheses, the door would be locked in the morning. They both do a decent job, an equally decent job of explaining the data. But the difference is the prior probability in what's the prior probability in the hypothesis that I assigned to I forgot to lock the door? Well, pretty high. That happens or I forgot that I locked the door. Pretty high. That happens all the time. I have no way of assessing the prior probability of, and I picked a bad example because I started postulating ontologies that we don't know exist, like a spirit realm and all that. I don't think you can use this epistemology to calculate priors for ontologies
or a criminal
that don't exist.
locked it on his way out.
Yeah, I mean, as far as I'm concerned, the prior probability in this context, the prior probability in the spirit realm right there, I can't calculate it until it's not a functional way of using this particular epistemology because I can't calculate the prior. But this is just the way I view evidence. And so that's why, you've heard me say before, okay, if everybody went to a baseball game and after the baseball game, all 10,000 of them claimed that they saw an alien spaceship.
Right.
That would raise the probability that I would count that as evidence for the alien spaceship. It wouldn't be to the point that I believed it because
now I remember.
Yeah, so we had this long conversation about this, and
but
so it's about whether the data is more likely on the truth of the proposition versus the falsity of the proposition. So if the proposition is an alien spaceship landed in the field, then the probability that we would observe this evidence, right, is 100% essentially, that everyone would be saying alien spaceship landed in the field. But what's the probability that we would see this without an alien spaceship landing in the field? Well, it's lower, which is why it would count as evidence for the alien spaceship. But then we have to multiply the prior probability of the alien spaceship versus the prior probability of some other explanation and see which one comes out after the math, essentially. And that's the one that it's better evidence for.
Yeah, but Dave, there's no evidence that, so what about ghost ship? Is it evidence that it's a ghost ship?
So you're expressing a really low degree of confidence in the prior probability. That's what you're expressing. It's I don't know. Well, actually, I would say that the probability of an alien ship is higher than a ghost ship. And the reason is
it is because we have examples of life.
Yeah.
But
good.
But
we don't have to talk about that.
Yeah, but we don't. But there's just no. Just everyone observing this is not evidence of alien spacecraft, but evidence of an event.
Well, so this is one of the situations where we have a number of prior possible hypotheses, and one of them is going to be an alien spaceship landed in the field. Another one's going to be, a government test landed in the field on emergency landing. Some other one's going to be some clever magician, hologram, optical illusion. Yeah. Another one's going to be, we could think of, 5 or 6 and we're going to have different prior probabilities in each of these things.
Sure. Yeah.
All
yeah.
of
I
these
agree with
things
that.
would explain the data, right? And so which one, I'm going to say it's technically it might be evidence for all of them, but it's going to be evidence for one over the other. And it's going to be the one that has the highest prior probability, because I'm going to have to multiply the prior probability times the probability of observing the evidence on the truth of the proposition.
So Dave, if someone was to say God emerged himself before us, 10,000 people, that you're trying to make the argument that explains the data.
Well, if that were true, it would explain the data. Like if that hypothesis were true, like
okay,
if God
yeah, I think you need to. I think you
Red
need to
Sea.
state it that way, because or else
exactly that way.
Yeah, because
it would explain the data if it were true.
Sure, yeah,
okay.
Or
the better way
sense.
of saying it, yeah. And there's different degrees to which it can explain the data. Like if it were true, there might still only be a 50% probability of observing the data, and that's the probability we multiply the prior of the truth of the proposition by.
Right.
That sounded like a bunch of gibberish, but with the whole when we're starting to postulate ontologies that we don't know exist or possible, I have a difficulty using this epistemology structure because I don't know how to assign a prior, and if I can't assign a prior probability to a candidate hypothesis, I can't calculate whether or not some fact is evidence or not.
Yeah, so often, Dave, that I think what you're talking about, that struggle, like from a skeptic's perspective, that's typically where the I don't know answer to the question comes in, where it's just like we have no way to factor one way or another or this way or that. It's like nothing. It's just the best we got, and people with scientific worldview in those situations are just like, I don't know. We don't know.
Yeah,
you know?
I don't know. I don't have, and is this evidence? I might not know if it's evidence, right?
Sure.
I might not know if it raises or if it should raise the epistemic probability at all. I just have no idea.
Yeah, because it might just be an emergent quality of your brain, right? So oftentimes people will be like, oftentimes people be like, well, even if it was an emergent quality of your brain, that's evidence. Well, it's like. It's like you might, your self-proclamation about this as an emergent quality in your brain might be the colloquial style of, well, this is evidence to me, or this is courtroom evidence that might be presented. But obviously to anyone trying to actually figure out what occurred, they're going to be like, okay, you're telling us that this happened in your head, but it actually might have manifested itself in reality. So it's like we don't know either way, right?
Right. I mean, there are all kinds of prior.
And it all
I have a difficulty. Like, I like to distinguish between a hypothesis of which the necessary constituents do have an empirical basis, which would be something like aliens.
Yeah.
Like, look, we've never observed aliens, and we don't know that there are any aliens.
Yeah.
But we do know that life
highly plausible
on planets, and we know that there are a lot of planets and a lot of candidates, and we know that people can traverse space in ships, and we know that I mean, all of the factors that you need to build the alien hypothesis,
although
we do actually know that those things are real.
Here's one though,
I want to
Dave.
distinguish that.
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
Here's one though about the alien thing. It's like the more we figure out like about the speed at which things can travel, and then we look at the vast distances, it's like it kind of is it's kind of an end game for the space travel fantasy, even at the speed of light, right?
Have you seen? Have you looked into the concept of the Alcubierre warp drive is a concept where you can move, because the only things that are limited by the speed of light are things with mass, right?
Yeah.
Things that don't have mass are not limited by the speed of light.
You need to basically become a photon.
Yeah, a photon is not limited. Well, photon is synonymous with light, but it has no mass, right?
Yeah.
It's not limited by.
Yeah.
And so But another thing that isn't limited by the speed of light is like space-time itself. It's not, you can move and twist and pull, and if you space-time could move at any speed. It's the fabric of reality, I guess you would call it. Isn't like gravity. Gravity warps space-time, and that can happen at any speed.
Yeah.
And so there's this, and I'm not a physicist, so don't ask me too many questions about this.
Yeah, me neither.
But there's the Alcubierre warp drive is this mathematically demonstrable, as in it's possible within the rules of physics. If it's not possible from an engineering perspective, we don't know if it's possible from an engineering perspective, but at least in accordance with the laws of physics, if we had an infinite amount of energy and resources and whatnot, you could create a warp bubble of space-time around a ship using a gravity, I guess. I don't know how you... And then you could move at any speed you would like, essentially, through the cosmos. Whether we'll ever be able to do that, I have no idea. But...
Yeah, it's interesting stuff to think about. And of course, if you can... teleport essentially at any speed, or it'll look like that, but then I mean you could bounce around wherever you wanted essentially.
I wanted to make the distinction between something like that, where all of the blocks of the hypothesis we know are possible, to something like a ghost, where like that postulates ontological realities, like whole different ontologies.
Yeah, this is why we call those things supernatural, because it's not consistent with the natural forces and laws that we observe.
Yeah. And I hate the word supernatural because I don't know what it means.
Everyone hates it, as far as I can tell, besides the people that actually use it like it's worth a damn. But anytime someone says, you're trying to deal with this proposition within the natural realm, you need to think outside that in the supernatural realm. Well, such a realm hasn't been demonstrated.
Just a second, I gotta go. Hold on.
Yeah. What up, Bruno?
Hey, man. What's up?
How's it hanging today?
Not much. Just listening. What exactly are you guys talking about?
This is Dave's day to run the conversation. We've been talking about what is evidence, and just going through, kind of mapping through epistemology in general.
Oh, yeah. Not my area of expertise then.
I don't think. I don't think any of us are necessarily experts, but it's been a good conversation for sure.
Yeah, I just got in. Just wanted to know what's in the go with
nice.
Did you say something? Or?
No. I was just. I thought Dave jumped back in there, but I think I am gonna. End the stream.
Mate, so you're just quick question, so you're Canadian.
Yeah, I am. Yeah.
And so you've met Jordan Peterson.
Yeah, I've worked with Jordan on quite a few projects.
Oh, that's crazy.
But yeah, I produced the Sam Harris Jordan Peterson conversations.